Hi everyone, I'm Shelley and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another Question the Narrative video, and today's topic is Flat Earth. Is the Bible a science book? We're going to begin this video with the full disclosure that I am, I would say, upwards of 95% sure that the Earth is probably a plane and not a sphere. So, with that being said, though, I want to get into this idea of using the Bible as a science book, which is something that, if you would have asked me even last year what I thought about that, even a few months ago, I would have said, well, the Bible is not really a science book, but we could certainly use it because it answers all of those questions about how the earth was formed. In fact, I even took the science book view of the Bible even before I started believing in what we'll still call biblical cosmology. Years ago, when I was at my old church, I was in an apologetics class, and I remember one of the elders saying that the earth is not, sorry, not the earth, that the Bible is not a science book. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, he is so wrong. Like, it really triggered me to hear this elder say that the Bible is not a science book, because at that time I was still using it, just to disprove evolution and all of these other things. So, my views have changed a bit, though, on using the Bible as a science book as proof of the shape of the earth. And I'm going to go over that with you today. Since I've been deep diving into preterism for over a year now and have been learning a lot about the use of apocalyptic language in the Bible, because yes, it was very common to be used, especially in Bible prophecy, I started to get confused sometimes when it came to the use of heaven and earth, because I understood that heaven and earth is very often used to describe not the physical heaven and earth, but that its use was often used symbolically. So, one example of that would be heaven and earth as the temple, heaven as in the temple, and earth as in God's people. So, if you don't know this about the temple, it's really interesting. The inner court of the temple was often called earth. The Holy of Holies, which not in this one, but in many of the renderings, it was a cube, which is interesting when you think about New Jerusalem, because New Jerusalem is also described as a cube. And I believe that New Jerusalem is the spiritual temple. But anyway, not that's for a different video. So we have earth here. This was actually referred to as heaven in the temple, and the temple was known as the place where heaven and earth meet. This outer court here was often referred to as the sea, because this is the area where the Gentiles were allowed. The Gentiles were not allowed into this area. Only those from Israel were allowed in this inner court. And Israel is often known in the Bible as the earth, or sometimes as the land. And the word gay that is uh, interpreted as earth can also be interpreted as land, but it very often means the people of Israel. So if we think of the old heaven and earth, that would then be the old physical temple. That would the old heaven, which was the temple, would have been destroyed in AD 70, and the old earth would have been referring to national Israel in that old covenant period. So then if we're going to talk about the new heaven and earth, then that would refer to the new covenant spiritual temple and the new covenant spiritual Israel. So hopefully you can see why I did start to get a little confused. I'm like, how am I supposed to know when it's talking about the covenantal heaven and earth and when it's talking about the physical heaven and earth? I found this really interesting article here. I was just searching this Heaven and Earth Old Testament studies, and I'm just going to share with you the very first paragraph here, and I will leave a link in the description if you would like to read it some more. I actually found as I went, I clicked on the About Us just to see who was actually writing this. And it's actually Don Preston. It's like from 2006. But anyway, let me just read this to you because this might help a little bit. I know you're probably thinking, when are you going to get into flat Earth? It's coming. There is a great range of interpretations of the meaning and application of the biblical phrase heaven and earth. This short treatise may show how we can allow God in His Word to reveal to us how He used this language various times in the law and the prophets. This writer suggests that one of the major areas of difficulty in understanding correctly heaven and earth in the New Testament is the misunderstanding of how God referred to nations by this phrase in the Old Testament. We believe sincerely that a biblical concept of heaven and earth in the Old Testament will help us greatly and incorrectly understanding New Testament passages such as Acts 2:17 to 21, Matthew 24:25, and 2 Peter 3, as well as the book of Revelation. We will not be exhaustive in this piece of work, but hope to illustrate how symbolic heaven and earth was, even in the Old Covenant, rather than to assume that each time we encounter the phrase, we immediately are to think of this physical universe and its constituent elements. If the reader wishes, he can notice that even in Genesis, such words as sun, moon, and stars can apply to persons rather than normally understood, such as in Joseph's dream. But we want to start in the Pentateuch, then go to the Old Testament prophets for our study. So then he goes on to Genesis 1:1. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then in this one, Don Preston, he went on to say that in this verse, it is obviously talking about the physical heaven and earth because it's talking about the formation of the heaven and earth. And yeah, I would have agreed with that not too long ago. But now I'm actually starting to wonder. I have been reading Beyond Creation Science, New Covenant Creation from Genesis to Revelation, and it's by Tim Martin and Jeff Vaughn. And I'm starting to look at even Genesis 1:1 in a new light because what this book is talking about, and I have not made up my mind yet, but this is something that I am considering. Is it possible that Genesis 1:1 is also talking about the covenantal aspect of heaven and earth? Because those of us who are preterists will understand that the Bible ends with a covenantal judgment. So, would it be appropriate that the Bible actually begins with a covenantal creation, the creation of that actual covenant? Does that make sense? I think that it could possibly make sense because the Bible itself is a book about the covenant. And there's more than one covenant in there, but it is a covenantal book. So yeah, if you make the suggestion that maybe this verse itself is also covenantal, I would say that yes, I think that that is highly likely. But I'm not going to go any further into that today. That's just something for another video entirely. But this photo here, I actually have this on my dining room wall. It's framed on my dining room wall. And if you look down here, scripture that condemns the globe theory, and it has all of these scriptures listed. Now, I was going to tell you later, but I'm just going to say it now that many of the verses that I used to use to prove that the earth is a plane or flat, if you just want to, come right out and be blunt about it, I am starting to realize that many of those verses, not even just the Genesis verses, many of them were figurative, in my opinion, were figurative and were not literal descriptions of the earth. But again, I just want to remind you here, obviously that doesn't mean that I changed my mind about the shape of the earth. I just at this point in time am not comfortable using a lot of those verses because I don't think that I was using them in their proper context. Interestingly, and a hyperliteral interpretation of the book of Genesis actually came about through the Seventh-day Adventist Church, namely Ellen White, Visions by Ellen White, and through dispensationalism. And it would also be this movement that the new, I'm sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? The young earth. That's what I was trying to think of. The young earth creationism, so to speak, that is when all of that came about. The idea that the earth is, 6,000 to 10,000 years old actually came about through that movement. And again, the age of the earth is not something that I'm going to argue with anyone, because I honestly, I'm not sure. And I honestly don't really think that it matters all that much. But I do want to share with you a portion of this book, just because it does shed some light on all of this. um and I was going to talk about George McCready Price, and let's just say he was an Adventist who was known for writing a book, I believe, on flood theology. And it says, and this is on page 96 going into to page 97: but who was George McCready Price, and why did he defend young earth creationism against all other conservative Christians in the early 20th century? Because it's important to say here that before this time, most people agreed that the earth was very, very old, and they didn't think that it went against the Bible at all. So it was only at this point in time, in like the 1800s, early 1900s, that people really started to change their point of view on this. And I'm going to continue. The reason goes all the way back to the Plymouth Brethren and the events of 1830. George McCready Price emphasized dispensationalism and the imminent pre-tribulational rapture of the church. As a devout Seventh-day Adventist, Price also promoted Sabbath keeping, which means worshiping on Saturday, the seventh day of the week. The Adventists insisted on a literal 24-hour reading of the days of Genesis 1 in order to provide a theological defense for their strict Sabbatarian views. This, combined with a global view of the Genesis flood, led the Adventists to stand against every other Christian denomination with their young earth creationist views of Genesis. Adventist doctrine formed around the teachings of their chief prophetess, Ellen G. White, whom they considered to be divinely inspired. Much like Margaret MacDonald a few decades earlier, and that is the teenager who had the vision of the secret rapture, and that's actually where the pre-trib rapture comes from, is from a Margaret MacDonald's vision, I believe, in Scotland. Anyway, White had visions or trances where she would receive ostensibly God's revelation for the Adventist church. Many of these trances were directly related to dispensational premillennial futurism of the sort the Plymouth Brethren introduced. However, White did not merely concern herself with visions of the rapture and second coming of Christ. She also spoke at great length about Genesis. In one of these revelations, which occurred sometime before 1864, White offers her vision of the flood event. And I know we're not going to be talking about the flood today, but I want you to listen to this description, because this is something, it sounds like something I would have said just last year about antediluvian times and the state of the earth in that time period. Before the flood, and remember, this is from a vision that Ellen G. White claims that she had. Before the flood, there were immense forests. The trees were many times larger than any trees which we now see. At the time of the flood, these forests were torn up or broken down and buried in the earth. In some places, large quantities of these immense trees were thrown together and covered with stones and earth by the commotions of the flood. They have since petrified and become coal, which accounts for the large coal beds which are now found. This coal has produced oil. Then I'm going to skip ahead to pages 98 down into 99. George McCready Price forever put his mark upon the history of the Genesis debate when he set out to provide an academic defense for White's inspired visions. Knoll explains, modern or young earth creationism arose by contrast from the efforts of earnest Seventh-day Adventists who wanted to show that the sacred writings of Adventist founder Ellen G. White, who made much of a recent earth in the Noachian deluge, could provide a framework for studying the history of the earth. Especially important for this purpose was the Adventist theorist George McCready Price, who published a string of creationist works culminating in 1923 with the New Geology. That book argued that a simple or literal reading of early Genesis showed that God had created the world 6,000 to 8,000 years ago and had used the flood to construct the planet's geological past. Further down on page 99, this last portion I'm going to read to you. John C. Whitcomb Jr. and Henry Morris initially attempted to hide the origin of the basic ideas and scientific arguments in their 1961 book, The Genesis Flood. They sensed denominational differences between Adventists and other evangelicals might reflect badly upon their view, so they did not want to acknowledge the intellectual source for their thesis. So I just find that really interesting, because to know that the the root of the young earth creationism and the hyper literal translation of Genesis 1 is actually from that source. And in this book, it goes on to argue that very often your eschatology is going to match what your views are of the beginning of the book, so to speak. So what you think about the creation of the earth very often affects what you think about the end. So people in the evangelical community, we know that they have a very, very literal understanding of end times events, and then to match, they have very, very literal understanding of the creation events. Whereas those of us who are preterists understand that it was figurative language that the Hebrews used when they were writing. And so would it not also be figurative language that was used when talking about the creation of the earth? I just think it's a very interesting possibility. Now, the fact that I'm just wondering about my interpretation of the verses that I had used to support biblical cosmology, again, I said it does not change my actual views, because, in my opinion, it is much easier to find verifiable and repeatable evidence proving that the earth is a plane. And I think that that is enough to show what the shape of the earth is. Now, what is actually very interesting is that this book, he is written, they're heliocentrists. And so this is one of those moments where I'm going to tell you, just because you don't agree with everything that an author says doesn't mean that you should refuse to read the book. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I have learned so much from these authors, but it's at this point where I'm going to say I do have to part with them on this one point of view, and I'm going to show you why, using even what it was that was written in the book. On page 368, it says, John places the entire test of truth on the reliability of his own senses when he lays the cornerstone of his first epistle. Now, I should say that this is actually in a section where they're talking about how we can use the Bible to learn the scientific method, and then they go on to use this to kind of not really, they didn't get into it a whole lot, but again, they're heliocentrists, and so they believe this can be used to support that. And I actually think that it's exactly the opposite. So let's go. I think that I have this pulled up, and then he shares this verse here. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it, and proclaimed to you the eternal life which was with the Father, and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. Now, that is so important, because it's telling us right here that which from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen, which we have looked upon and touched. So if we're thinking about the shape of the earth, what is it that we can use? We can trust our senses. And what is it that we see when we are looking at the ocean? What is it that we see as we are looking down the street? Are there actual verifiable, repeatable experiments that we can do ourselves that can prove that there's just no curvature? And my son-in-law is a surveyor, but I would love, he just started doing it, but I would love to ask him about if there is any curvature on a body of water. I mean, he might just be able to guess the answer to that, but I don't think that he actually has thought too much about it. But the question's coming. I will ask him at some point. Anyway, so I'm just going to go on from here. John finds the empirical proof so important that he repeats himself for emphasis. Now imagine what John would have said to modern philosophers who claim that no truth can be known through the senses. That claim implies that John could not have known the truth by the very means by which he states explicitly that he knows the truth. John knew the truth of Jesus Christ through his senses. He heard the Messiah. He touched the Messiah. He saw the Messiah. He bore witness to the truth because he could rely on his senses to evaluate the evidence and know the truth. So when we trust our senses, what is it that we experience with our senses? This is what I experience with my senses. And I know that there are people who will say, but if this were true, we would be able to look across the Atlantic Ocean and see the pyramids. And I honestly think that that is, I don't want to say idiotic, but it's a really dumb assertion because anyone should know that as things get farther away, they get smaller. So no matter how good your eyes are, how are you going to be able to see the pyramids across the ocean? I mean, come on. That makes no sense at all. And then they will say, oh, but what if you pull out a telescope? Then why can't we see it? Well, you can't see it because there is pollution, there is refraction, there is atmospheric lensing. There are all of these different natural processes that would cause that to happen, but the fact remains that when you look out over the water, which doesn't bend, what do you see? And then on page 374, um, the author has just shared another really great verse, which I realized I didn't pull up, but I will just read it to you. And it says here, the Bible records Jesus encouraging an empirical test as proof for his resurrection. So he's encouraging an empirical test. Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have. And that's from Luke 24:39. So again, I don't see how we can use these verses to support a heliocentric model because in all honesty, when we are looking at what we are usually taught in science class, they are things that we would never be able to see with our own senses. We're given these models of the earth that no one has ever actually been down inside there. In fact, I believe that 8 miles or less than 8 miles is the deepest that they've ever even been able to dig into the earth. And that's like a fraction of the crust. But then they give us these models as if they are 100% accurate when they themselves were not able to use these empirical tests that this book is talking about, and the same thing goes with this as well. We're handed this as evidence, and this is something that again we cannot experience with our own senses. The senses in that verse that shows us how important it is to use your senses for these things. We've got CGI models of from the Hubble telescope. Again, not something that comes from our own senses. This is something that is computer generated. I love this quote by Nikola Tesla. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. And amen, I say to that, Mr. Nikola Tesla, because even the whole idea of the sun being 93 million miles away. Do you have any idea how many times that actually that distance has been changed? We're given 93 million miles as if that's it. It's all said and done. That's how far away it is. How do they actually know? Has anybody ever actually traveled there and experienced this with their senses? No. They use mathematics, just as Nikola Tesla was just talking about. They use computer models. Astrophysics is actually theoretical because they have no way to prove these things. Yet, those of us who are down here on Earth are able to actually do experiments that we can test and see what is around us. And we don't even have to use experiments all the time. I believe that we can just trust what we see in front of us. And if anyone would be able to give me some sort of evidence that we can actually use our senses to see these things, fine. But at this point in time, I think that it's a really fun story. And, I used to love movies about space. I thought it was a really cool concept. My great uncle worked for NASA, well, for a contractor of NASA. Uh, I was just really into all of this stuff. So, I would love to find out that, yes, it really does look like this out there. But I have serious doubts because these are all things that are just handed to us. So, in a nutshell, those are just my current thoughts on flat Earth. Like I said, I'm not so sure that I can go back and use the verses that I was used to because I think that a lot of those were figurative. But I think that if we use the method instructed by the Bible to use our senses, I think that it's pretty obvious that it is what we see around us. And I just want to end this video with this quote by Galileo. The scriptures are given to teach us not how the heavens go, but how to go to heaven. That's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one down below. And if you like my work and would like to become a channel member, I will leave a link in the description box for my channel page, or you can click on it right on my channel page. I meant for my channel membership before. Anyway, I hope you have a great day.